Good evening and welcome to Byline. This is a public affairs show right here at Amherst Media, and it's co-sponsored by the Amherst League of Women Voters. And for those of you who've been joining us regularly, you know that this is our weekly effort to help you understand how our town government is evolving ever since the new charter was passed, and we've been implementing our new government. And sometimes we have town councilors on, sometimes town staff, and sometimes, as with this evening, we have people who are involved in some of the active committees and commissions in town. And our guest tonight is no stranger to this town, Doug Slaughter. He is the chair of the commission that is in charge of licensing. And but before we get into what's going on at the licensing commission, let's remind people about your background. You started a town meeting.
I started a town meeting,
and then...
so from there, I got the opportunity to serve on the finance committee, and then I was on this finance committee for several years. Served on joint capital planning committee as part of that, and served in that role, and then subsequently ran for and was elected to the select board and served there for 4.5 years or so, and was chair at the end of its cycle. So I was familiar with working in town government, in particular licensing, as a result of that. But I got a number of years under my belt in town government.
So you were a transitional leader. You had to help guide the Board of Selectmen and the town government through the final months of our old form of government.
That's right.
And as we prepared to launch the new form. And we had a licensing commission back then. We have a licensing commission now.
Right.
So let's start with, are there any big differences? How would we know that there's a new town government if we looked at the licensing commission?
So mostly it's a name change. So the state law, has what they call generically the local licensing authority. The LLA is the term you'll see in the state website around licensing like alcohol and that sort of thing. In towns that have select boards, the select board serves that role. In cities, they often will set up a board of license commissioners or something of that sort. Some communities they're elected, some communities they're appointed. In our community, by virtue of our charter, it's an appointed group of officials that have volunteered their time to serve the community in that way. As far as function, it's pretty much identical to what the select board did in the past. Really the same roles and responsibilities.
Because they were the licensing commission in the past.
That's correct. There's a few subtle differences, but very, very few. So most of the things the select board would have taken up relative to local licensing is absolutely within our wheelhouse of things we do as well.
Okay, so let's drill down just a little bit more on that. So if we think about the fact that we have a town manager who's in the executive, we have our legislative body, which is our town council, which used to be our licensing commission, and now we have a licensing commission that is separately appointed.
Right.
So how do those three entities interact?
Well, we're largely, as the Board of License Commissioner, in the executive, although we do have some judicial responsibilities around some of the enforcement, but largely we're an executive branch type of body. We create policy and regulation relative to the licensing. Obviously, we want to keep the council on board with what we're doing, and their input is necessary. There are a few things that with regard to like state law that require adoption that may have to engage the council to do that. In the same way that town meeting would have done those kind of things in the past. There are a few things that we do have the authority to adopt on our own from state law. But largely it's pretty much the exact same structure as Select Board had. And we sit in that same place structurally, and we try to keep council aware of what's going on and obviously listen to their feedback if they have ideas. They're plugged into the electorate pretty intensely by virtue of the way the charter is set up, and so we want to hear what they have to say and the constituents have to say.
Great. So I'm thinking that the town administrator, the town manager, is probably responsible for screening applicants who could be appointed to the commission, and then makes recommendations to the town council, and the town council makes the appointments?
That's correct.
And then once those appointments are made, you operate independently of both the town manager and the town council.
That's correct.
That said, you can make proposals for changes that you want to make that might need approval of the town council. So, for example, you have regulations here in town for things, let's say, like the alcohol beverage licenses.
Right.
So that's, the state gives us a certain number of licenses we can give out.
Correct.
And you are responsible, the commission is responsible for allocating those.
That's right.
And enforcing the laws to the best of your ability.
Right.
The Alcohol Beverage Control Commission can come into the state, into the community as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But when they're not in town, you're the sheriff.
That's exactly right, and we do have that responsibility. You know, the ABCC will do enforcement. I was at actually they did a workshop yesterday in Montague. They were doing kind of a tour this time of year around the state to touch base with local licensing authorities and you know, staff, you know, town staff around licensing. And the way they phrased it is the ABCC has pretty much the same roles and responsibilities that the local licensing board has. But they operate separately because they're not sort of plugged into the particular concerns of a community. So they're much more concerned with the sort of technical aspects of state law and enforcement relative to that. And they only have so many people that can go around and do enforcement action, but they do regularly do that. If there is an enforcement action, they are the body to which, you know, the enforcement is appealed to. So they do serve in that role as well. And so there's times when there are interactions between us and them that they won't comment on because they have to ultimately handle appeals if there's a case like that. So if we have policy relative to...
So you can implement your own regulations.
Absolutely.
If a party feels aggrieved, their review and their appeal goes to the state.
That's correct.
And to the ABCC in the case of the liquor licenses.
In a perfect example, and yes, in a liquor license circumstance, so it's, you know, advised by virtue of the ABCC that we should establish policies relative to enforcement. So if we have someone who violates the terms of their liquor license, that we have they prefer to see, and most communities have, a progressive action series that they take relative to those infractions.
So you don't whack them the first time.
Exactly.
You give them another chance.
Exactly. Generally, you know, most of the those kinds of issues come in. The first time it happens, it's a bit of an oversight by a business. You want to send a strong message that we don't want to tolerate things that are outside the norms for our community. But at the same time, you know, if you say withhold their license for a number of days, that's a very severe economic penalty to that individual business. Sure. And so you have to be very careful with that. And I think that that's something the ABCC is attuned to and wants to see progressive action and stepwise and thoughtful, you know, enforcement of the laws. But they understand that, you know, communities have circumstances that fall outside the bounds of a simple infraction or a failure of management policy on the part of a business, and that you have to take a more significant action sometimes. There's certainly times you're allowed to do that.
Very good. And you referenced what I would call community standards.
Right.
So some communities look at things in one way and others will look at it in another way. And so the regulations you develop at the local level can be sensitive to community standards and ideas, but within a general rubric established by the state.
Absolutely. And the state does want to give communities the appropriate tools to structure their licensing and their enforcement that suits their needs. So, for example, we as a community that has 3 higher education institutions have a much different set of needs and concerns than a community out in the Berkshires that has a couple hundred, you know, in their population. It's a much different set of standards and concerns and needs that we have, and so we are allowed to do that, and they encourage us to do that.
And that's a really excellent example because this community's population doubles for all intents and purposes in terms of residents and goes even much higher than that in terms of people who visit the community every day because they live elsewhere but may teach here or may study here. So we have a really excellent example of things that can go awry, and your commission faced a really challenging situation less than a year ago,
Right.
months ago, really.
Months ago.
And you had to use your enforcement powers to address that.
That's correct. So we had a business in town that had, fortunately or unfortunately, come into existence right at the tail end of the select board's tenure. And so the select board was the licensing authority, had granted a license to them, and they started their business within the community, and we had some indications that they may not have been a good operator. And we were, the Board of License Commissioners was just getting underway, and we had heard some of this. We authorized the police to be our enforcement agents, in other words, which makes sense because they do that kind of work all the time. They went and did some of the work that they do, which is excellent, and we appreciate that, and came to us with an initial violation. Because it was a first time, no previous history of that, we took a pretty modest approach. It was a fairly serious infraction of lack of control relative to underage service, and so we suspended their license for a few days, a fairly short period of time. I think you have to sort of strike the right balance, but we took it away for a few days. That had a certain penalty and effect on them. But fairly shortly after that, there was a much more egregious violation. And it was one that we just felt was an indication that they were not going to comply and not going to be a good participant in our community. And it's as one of the counselors said, it's one thing from, it's currently unfortunate, but we hope that we don't get to a situation where something tragic happens. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was very apropos that he made that statement, because I think we sometimes forget the power that some of these things have and the potential for really tragic things to happen as a result. People will make mistakes, and especially young people, and we have lots of them, so we want to try to provide an environment that's safe and responsible for everyone and not too constraining in other ways. But yet if people aren't going to participate and act as good stewards of the license, we do and will take it away if we need to. And it was unfortunate. We haven't had to do that, and not recent memory for sure. Mm-hmm. Certainly never when I was on the select board. We did one other enforcement case while I was on the select board. Mm-hmm. But generally we've had tremendous support from our business community to operate in a way that makes sense and is helpful and healthy to our student population and the community as a whole.
And mentioning the business community, that's really important, because it's not just that you enforce the regulations because you're supposed to enforce the regulations.
Right.
But the regulations, as you just said, help create safety and a proper environment in which our community can function. But then it goes another step, which is if you let a business operate in a way that is not in conformity with the regulations, you're being unfair to the other businesses in the community who are taking all the measures and implementing what they need to. And some of these things are not easy to do.
That's exactly
right. But they
right.
work hard at it,
right.
And they have to know that it's meaningful.
Right.
So I think you sent a very powerful message to the whole community.
Right.
When you gave chances,
right.
but then you followed the rules,
right.
And they could have corrected their problems and they didn't.
That's correct. And I think that, as you say, that sort of idea of the way I think of it relative to regulation, I think this is regardless of what form of government or what level of government, it has to strike the right balance between encouraging business, but also protecting the public at large. And so we don't want to create regulation that's too confining, too constraining in such a way that businesses cannot operate or can't operate in any sensible way. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we don't want them to run completely without guidance or boundary at all. Now, if we didn't, many would operate in a reasonable way, because most people are that way, but you would also have some that wouldn't. Right. And so if you don't have your sort of policy and regulation in place, you don't have a framework from which to try to constrain or bring those folks back into alignment with the standards of the community.
Right. And among the standards and values of the community are fairness.
Absolutely.
And flexibility.
That's right.
And understanding. So that's why you have multiple steps.
Absolutely.
What else do you license?
So there's a number of things that we license. So I was thinking about this in preparation of our conversation this evening, and we sit in an interesting place. So some of the things in which get regulated by the town are handled by, say, zoning, and some things are handled by, say, Department of Health or the Board of Health, and they have more, I would say, cut and dried requirements that they're enforcing. And we sit in that place in between and try to mesh with those. So there are things that we regulate, for example, inn holders, food carts, common victualler licenses, which is what is necessary to have a restaurant in town. That's not the same as the food licensing, which goes through the Board of Health and the health inspectors, which is a different but yet layered license for a different purpose. And so that's more about compliance with food safety, and ours is again about a measure of do they fit and do they serve our community well. So we have an interesting place to sit relative to those more specific requirements in those other areas. We will probably, although we haven't yet, we will probably take up the topic of retail marijuana or recreational marijuana, and whether to create a local license for that, and what parameters we're seeking to put on that, and where I think it's appropriate is that currently the town manager negotiates a host community agreement. That's required by law. That's a necessary step in getting to state approval for those types of facilities. I think there's a place for a public conversation about the appropriateness of those that's different from the zoning, where it has particular rules about distance and measurements and all of that sort of thing. So I think we have a place that can sit kind of on the front end of the process to have a public conversation about a facility or potential facility before it goes to the host community agreement and negotiation with the manager around those specific items in that, and then moves to the state for approval in that regard. So I think we might take up that topic in the coming year or so, because I think it's something that's going to be, again, in much the same way alcohol is in our community. It's very important that we do it right. We have a large young population, and I think we have a responsibility to those kids.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if other communities have entertained this notion, and do you have any examples of where they've actually done it? It's pretty new.
It's pretty new.
Licensing of recreational facilities, and it's just barely a couple of years old now.
Right, and I think that, from the standpoint, if you look at recreational, I think Northampton was first as far as having a facility open, as far as Western Massachusetts.
State.
Yeah, so that's only been, it's less than 6 months.
That's for recreational, that's correct.
That's for recreational. Medical's been a couple of years, but recreational is very, very new. And I think people are there's a much different mindset, appropriately so, relative to recreational. I'm not aware of anybody that has implemented anything yet. There may be one or two, but I think a number of communities are thinking about it. We're certainly trying to be proactive in that way, and members of our former select board and our economic development director have been very active with the state in their development of policy and regulation. Coming on from recreational is potentially social consumption, so a cafe type of circumstance may become something that's allowed. Amherst is certainly a community that would probably be interested in that, or there would be business owners that would be interested in creating that type of facility, and so we'll be well served to be thinking about that and trying to prepare for that circumstance.
Seemed to me that there'd be some complications and challenge, because if you come along in a year or so and 1, 2, 3 shops are operating, so for example there's one up on Meadow Street right now,
right?
So how do your regulations affect a business that was already established under previous rules? But as you just described it, you're looking at the front end more than the back end.
Right.
That said, once you do something in the front end, you want to make sure that what's done later is consistent with what was established in the discussions and the decisions,
right,
as it gets implemented. So
yeah, we're in a little bit of a tricky spot because there is already a recreational facility open in town. Right. To my knowledge, they're a good operator within our community, so that'll be helpful to us. And so I think that it has been made clear to anyone who's even entertaining the idea of going into a host community agreement that we might put in a local license. Most of our licenses, once you acquire the license, and this is true for alcohol licenses or any other license, once you acquire the license, renew it annually, generally unless there's been a problem relative to operating properly within the community, it's a fairly straightforward and easy renewal. So it's unlikely we would take up any topic, in my mind anyway. You know, my fellow members on the board
may have different
ideas about this, but my thinking is that will probably not, you know, the impact on any existing business will be minimal, other than the process to file and get the license. And you know, so we'll not be suddenly changing the game significantly that would catch them off guard in any way. And as we go through the process of developing those regulations, we'll probably talk with them considerably to see what they have to say and think about, you know, the constraints we might be wanting to impose, or the kinds of questions we're going to ask. Partly because of their own experience in our community, but they may have experience in other communities and know of what other communities are doing. So we'll definitely rely on them to help inform us. Well, obviously, you know, if we feel there's a certain boundary that needs to be created or enforced in some way, we'll create that boundary and enforce it. But we'll try to do it in such a way that they have time to prepare and there's an appropriate transition period, that sort of thing.
Amherst has a strong reputation of taking the time and going through public process when you're developing something new. So I think people could take some comfort, even though this is something that may be totally new that people didn't anticipate, that it'll be done well and it'll be done right, because people will take the time, and it's in the nature of the community. And I say over and over again on this show, transparency and civic engagement are two of the pillars of the new charter, and everybody has always worked on those things in town, but it's these have an even higher focus now. And in the interest of full disclosure, I'm involved with a group of people who are working on trying to site a facility here in town, so I'll probably be involved in that discussion if I'm lucky. But in full disclosure, you brought it up, I didn't, and I'm not trying to influence your decision.
That's all right.
Until the process begins.
That's right.
This is just an idea that you're putting on the table.
Right, and we may go through our due diligence relative to setting up a license and recognize that it may not be an appropriate thing to do.
May not need it.
May not be needed, may not be appropriate, but we want to do that.
But your example of alcohol, which is licensed at both the state and local level, and you're talking about a different substance but similar kind of thing. It's a recreational substance, and you do have the issue of both being legal at 21, and we have an extraordinarily large population under 21.
That's right.
So you can see how the town might want to think about how do we, especially in areas relating to that. I know in conversations that I've been having with people on the subject, there's a lot of concern about vaping in town and how many young people are getting access to vaping devices. And vaping, it can be done also with cannabis product.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of those things, you know, speaking to folks of our age tend to think of it in a very specific way, but the number of products that are available is, you know, quite...
edibles, you can ingest now in many different forms.
That's right. You know, exactly. And it's a much different circumstance than the sort of, you know, classic comedy movies from the 70s format that you might think of.
Cheech and Chong.
Exactly. You know, that still happens, but there are so many other ways. And I think, to be honest, some of that's been driven by, you know, inventive people with the desire to you know, recreationally enjoy cannabis, but they're also on the medical front. I think that's some of what drove some of that as well, because there was a need for using it in a medical sense that needed to be different than that sort of classic.
That's correct. I mean, it's a whole different world, and people have been talking about this for generations, and it's finally come. And but the materials and the products are very different now. I mean, even the products that are smoked are much, much more powerful.
Exactly.
And so it takes a lot of care in using the material as well. So, but let's switch to something else in the final couple of minutes. Are all of your regulations for the existing licenses kind of up to speed, or does the commission think that it's time to review and revise some elements of some of them?
We have a few that have needed and continue to need some adjustment. In serving on the select board, you know, we recognized as we went through the process of granting licenses, renewing licenses, we had some areas where that needed attention. They hadn't been dealt with in a long time, so circumstances have changed. We understood that some things in practicality hadn't really worked out the way we thought they would, and so they need some refinement and adjustment in that regard. A recent one that we took up as a board was the BYOB. We didn't have any, and that's, fortunately we haven't been in a situation where that had been problematic in our community, but without any regulation whatsoever, there's lots of latitude for people to behave however they choose to, and that can be a very unfortunate circumstance. And so I think by virtue of having gone through the circumstance with having to revoke a license in that particular business, we thought we really need to have something on the books relative to this really quickly. Because if there were other issues at that location, but if they hadn't had any others, what they might have done relative to alcohol in a BYOB circumstance could have been very, very difficult for us to deal with without regulation. So we put those in place. We'll probably refine those some more as we live with them. And we're looking at, speaking of alcohol service, we're looking at food service relative to that. The select board several years ago had put in a series of requirements around food service. And we recognize that a lot of businesses can't comply with that. And so we're sitting in a situation with businesses that are not fully compliant with it. And so from an enforcement and fairness standpoint, both from the standpoint of us as a board trying to enforce it, as well as the businesses trying to operate in good faith, there's a lot of variability, and so we want to try to get to a new place that's a little better in that regard. Private clubs is another one. I think that will also play into the marijuana issue, because private clubs might be the direction people go around social consumption. So we'll need to have our club regulations in good order. And so there's a few things that need some attention in a way that clarifies what we're trying to do, doesn't require institutional knowledge of staff and or board members to implement. And so it's a much fairer and functional place to be.
Terrific. Well, thank you for bringing us up to date on our newly established commission that handles licensing, and letting us understand a little bit more about how that all transitioned into our new form of government. And with that, I thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you for your service in the past and for continuing on the commission. Thank you.
Thank you.